The first time Harvey Cooper laid eyes on Eliza Harper, she was arguing with a mule and winning. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat baking under a sun that had no mercy and no manners. The cattle trails were thick with dust and commerce, and the streets smelled of leather and ambition and horse sweat. Harvey had ridden in from 3 weeks on the Kishom Trail, his bones aching and his spirit somewhere between exhausted and hollow, the way it always got when he had been too long with only cattle and sky for company. He had tied his horse, a sorrel gelding named Biscuit, to the post outside Harmon's general store, and he had been about to push through the door when the sound of a woman's voice stopped him cold. Not the sound of a woman screaming, which was not uncommon on the edges of a cattle town. Not the sound of weeping, which he had heard plenty of in his 28 years. It was the sound of a woman talking very plainly and very firmly to a large gray mule that had decided it was not going to move another inch from the middle of the street, and the wagon it was hitched to was blocking everything and everyone, and nobody, not the driver of the freight wagon behind it, not the 2 boys who had come to try to help, not the man in the bowler hat who kept suggesting things with his hands, was doing anything useful. "I understand you are tired," the woman was saying, standing directly in front of the mule with her hands on her hips and her dark hair coming loose from its pins in the wind. "I understand this town is loud and you have had a long morning. But I have had a longer one, and I am not inclined to stand here until nightfall, so I suggest we come to an agreement." The mule blinked at her. Harvey stood on the boardwalk and did not move. He had seen hard women in his years on the trail, women who ran saloons with iron fists and kept pistols beneath their aprons, women who had crossed plains and buried children and kept going with their jaws set and their eyes like flint. He respected those women in the way you respect a cliff face, with admiration and some caution. He had also seen soft women who fanned themselves and deferred to their husbands, and who looked at the open country the way some men looked at the ocean, like it was beautiful and terrifying, and something they wanted no part of. He did not think less of those women either. The world was hard enough without judging a person for how they bore it. But Eliza Harper was neither of those things, and it stopped him in his tracks the way nothing had in a long time. She was not performing toughness. She was not pretending at fragility. She stood in the dust of a Kansas street in a plain brown dress that had seen better days, her boots cracked at the toe, talking to a mule with the patient logic of a schoolteacher, and the steady authority of a woman who simply expected the world to cooperate because she had asked it to nicely, and she was not going to ask again. The mule moved. It actually moved, stepping sideways and then forward with a kind of reluctant dignity, and the woman gave it a single firm pat on the nose and then went back to the wagon seat and picked up the reins as though this was entirely ordinary. Harvey Cooper laughed. He had not expected to laugh. It came out of him before he could stop it, a short and genuine sound, and the woman on the wagon seat turned and looked at him. Her eyes were brown, the deep, warm kind that looked almost amber when the light hit them right. She was perhaps 24 or 25, with a face that was not conventionally pretty in the way the portraits in shop windows were pretty, but was striking in a way that stayed with you, the kind of face that you remembered more clearly an hour later than you did when you were looking at it. There was a directness to her gaze that most people Harvey knew would have called boldness, and that he found immediately and inexplicably refreshing. "Something funny," she said. Her voice was measured, not unkind. "No, ma'am," he said, pulling off his hat out of some impulse he had not quite decided on yet. "I just haven't seen anyone reason with a mule before. I didn't know it worked." She looked at him for a moment. "Most people don't try," she said. And then she clicked her tongue at the mule and drove the wagon forward, and the street opened up again, and people moved, and Harvey Cooper stood on the boardwalk with his hat in his hand and watched her go. He went into Harmon's store and got his supplies. He bought flour and salt and dried beans and a new coil of rope. Old Silas Harmon wrapped everything up in brown paper and talked about the weather and the cattle market and a horse thief who had been through last week. Harvey listened and paid and asked, because something was pulling the question out of him whether he wanted it to or not, who the woman with the wagon was. Silas Harmon raised his eyebrows with the particular expression of a man who has been in a small enough community to know everything about everyone. "That's Eliza Harper," he said. "Widow woman. Took over her late husband's quarter section about 7 miles south. Been here going on 8 months. She managed it herself, far as anyone can tell. She's got a hired hand, old fellow named Amos, been here since before the territory, but she runs the place." Silas paused with the weighted pause of a man who has an opinion he has been saving. "She's an interesting woman, I'll say that much. Doesn't take to being told what she ought to do." Harvey picked up his parcels. "Much obliged," he said, and went back out into the sun. He told himself he was not going to think about Eliza Harper any further than that. He had a job. He had a bunkhouse at the Reardon Ranch 12 miles north, and a foreman named McCready who would want him back by sundown, and cattle to check on before the spring drive. He was a working man with working man's concerns, and interesting widows on quarter sections 7 miles south were none of his business. He thought about her the whole ride back. It was not a romantic thought, exactly. It was more the way a man thinks about something that doesn't quite fit into any category he already has. He had grown up on his father's ranch in Texas, and he had known all manner of women by the time he was grown, and he had developed over the years a kind of unconscious filing system, the way people do. Not cruel, just practical. But Eliza Harper did not fit anywhere he tried to put her, and that bothered him in the same way a stone in a boot bothers a man, persistently and right in the middle of everything else. He saw her again 2 weeks later at the water rights meeting in the town hall. It was a hot evening in late May, and the hall smelled of lamp oil and men who had been working since before dawn. There was a dispute between 3 ranch operations and 2 smaller claims about access to the creek that ran through the southern quarter of the county. Harvey was there on behalf of the Reardon Ranch, which had the biggest stake, and he sat in the back row with his foreman McCready and listened to everyone argue. Eliza Harper sat in the 3rd row from the front, alone, with a piece of paper on her knee on which she had written numbers. Harvey noticed her before he recognized her, noticed the stillness of her among all the shifting and throat-clearing and boot-scraping. When the county assessor asked if anyone had additional concerns, she stood up without hesitation. "Harper claim, Section 14, she said, loud enough to be heard clearly. "The proposal as written gives the Reardon operation first draw rights from March through August. I'd like to understand the reasoning, because that covers the months when my stock needs water most, and I'm downstream." There was a brief male silence of the sort that Harvey recognized as the kind that happens when a room full of men is recalibrating whether to take someone seriously. McCready shifted beside him. "The Reardon operation runs 3,000 head, said the assessor carefully. The larger operation has more political weight," Eliza said, with absolutely no heat in it, just the plain delivery of an observation. "I understand that. I'm asking about the reasoning, not the politics. Is there water law that supports this priority, or is this a negotiation?" The assessor blinked. "It's both, I suppose." "Then I'd like to negotiate," she said, and sat back down with her paper on her knee and waited. Harvey found himself watching her for the next 40 minutes, not in the way a man watches a woman he is trying to charm, in the way a man watches something he cannot quite figure out. She made 2 more points, both clear and specific and based on numbers rather than emotion. And by the end of the meeting, she had secured alternate day draw rights during the summer months, which was not everything she had come for, but was considerably more than the assessor had expected to give. Outside afterward, as people were drifting back to their horses and wagons, Harvey walked in the same direction she did because their wagons were both on the same side of the building. He was aware of doing it and aware of the slight dishonesty of pretending it was purely coincidental, and that awareness itself was something new. "Evening," he said when they were close enough. She looked at him. "You're with the Reardon operation," she said. It was not a question. "Harvey Cooper, trail hand." He offered his hand. She shook it. Her grip was firm and brief. "Eliza Harper." "I know," he said. "Silas Harmon told me, after the mule incident." Something shifted in her expression. It was not quite a smile, and it was not quite amusement. It was the look of a person who has been observed and is deciding how to feel about it. "The mule incident," she repeated. "For what it's worth, I thought you handled it well." "Thank you," she said simply, without the self-deprecation or the fluttering dismissal he might have expected. Just, "Thank you," as though she had thought she had handled it well too and saw no reason to disagree. He stood there for a moment, holding his hat, and he did not know what to say next, which was unusual for him. He was not a man given to shyness. He had talked to women in saloons and at church socials and across the seats of stagecoaches, and he had generally found it easy enough because he knew what kind of woman he was talking to and he knew the kind of conversation that followed. But Eliza Harper kept not being the kind he expected, and his usual maps did not apply. "The alternate day rights," he said finally. "That was good work in there. Macready wasn't expecting it." "I don't imagine he was," she said. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Is that why you walked this way, to tell me that?" "I walked this way because my horse is on this side," he said honestly. "But yes, I wanted to say it." She looked at him for another moment, and then she said, "Your ranch has the better end of the arrangement, Mr. Cooper. I hope you know that." "I know it," he said. "I hope you'll remember it." She said it without challenge, not quite an accusation, just a statement of fact and a request that he hold on to it. Then she untied her horse, a compact chestnut mare that stood quietly while she mounted, and she rode off south into the dusk without looking back. Harvey stood by his horse and watched her until she disappeared over the rise, and Macready came up beside him and said, "You going to stand there all evening, or are we riding back?" "We're riding back," Harvey said, and swung up onto Biscuit, and told himself once more that this was nothing. By June he had stopped telling himself that, because it was clearly not nothing, and Harvey Cooper was many things, but he was not, at his core, a man who lied to himself for long. He saw her in town on a Saturday, buying wire at the hardware store. He helped her load it into her wagon without being asked, and she let him, which he had half expected her to refuse. And while they worked, she told him she was fencing the north pasture because her neighbor, a man named Aldrich, kept letting his stock drift onto her land and claiming ignorance. She said it in the calm, matter-of-fact way she said most things, but he heard the edge underneath it. Not anger exactly, but a kind of steady, alert wariness that spoke of a woman who had learned to handle problems before they grew. "You want me to talk to Aldrich," he said before he thought about it. She looked at him over the roll of wire. "No," she said. "I want to fence my pasture." He nodded. "Fair enough." "But thank you for offering," she added, and there it was again, that quality he could not name. She was direct without being cold. She declined help without being proud about it. She thanked him without owing him anything. He started finding reasons to ride south on his days off. The Reardon Ranch gave its men Sundays free, and the first Sunday in July, Harvey rode past Eliza Harper's claim on the way to nowhere in particular and found Amos, the old hired hand, struggling with a fence post that had heaved out of the dry ground. He stopped and helped, because it would have been inhuman not to, and Amos was grateful and talkative in the way of old men who spent most of their days in the company of cattle. Eliza came out with a tin cup of water an hour later, while they were setting the last post, and handed it to Amos and then handed one to Harvey and said, "Stay for supper if you like." He stayed for supper. The house was small and very clean. She had a kitchen with a good cast iron stove and a table with 4 chairs, 2 of which had clearly not been sat in some time. There were books on a shelf near the window, more than he would have expected, and a sampler on the wall that he looked at while she was at the stove and discovered said not a Bible verse but a Latin phrase he did not recognize, stitched neatly in blue thread. "What does that mean?" he asked, pointing. She glanced at it over her shoulder. "Per aspera ad astra. Through hardship to the stars. You stitched that yourself." "My mother did. She gave it to me when I left Missouri." He sat down at the table. Amos had gone home to his own small cabin at the edge of the property. The evening light came through the window in long gold bars and lay across the table between them. He asked about Missouri, and she told him about a family of 4 girls and a father who had been a school teacher and a mother who had believed fiercely in education for daughters as well as sons, and he heard in that telling the shape of why she was who she was. "Your husband," he said carefully, because it felt dishonest not to acknowledge it. "How long ago?" 14 months, she said without flinching. "His name was Daniel. He died of fever." She set a plate in front of him. "He was a good man. He wanted to come west, and I came with him because I wanted to come west too, not because he asked me to." That distinction mattered to him. Harvey looked at the plate. Beans and salt pork and cornbread. "It matters to me too," he said. She sat down across from him. "Good," she said. They ate and talked about the land. She had strong opinions about the drought cycles and the grass conditions, and the way the county was managing water. Opinions that were both practical and well-reasoned, and that he found himself genuinely engaging with rather than simply listening to politely. She asked him about the Kishom Trail, and he told her things he rarely told anyone. About the loneliness of it, the specific kind of loneliness that came from being surrounded by people and animals for weeks and still feeling essentially alone. She listened without filling the silence with reassurance, which he appreciated. When he stood to go, the sun was long down and the stars were thick over the Kansas plain. He stood in her doorway with his hat in his hands and said, "I'd like to come again, if you're amenable." She leaned against the doorframe and looked at him in the lamplight, considering. He was aware acutely that she was actually thinking about it rather than performing consideration. "Sunday dinners," she said at last. "Sunday's work. Amos will be here in the mornings and you can stay for the midday meal." "All right," he said. "I'm not looking to be courted, Mr. Cooper," she added, not unkindly. "I've been on my own long enough that I'm accustomed to it. I like good company and you seem like it, but I want to be plain with you about what I'm looking for." He thought about that. He thought about it very carefully because she deserved that. "I understand," he said. "I'm not sure what I'm looking for either. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't interested in more than your cooking." He paused. "But I meant what I said. I'll come on Sundays and we'll have dinner and see what we are to each other." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in quite a while." "I'm trying," he said. She smiled then for the first time, a real full smile that changed her whole face in the best possible way, and he thought, there it is. That's the thing. He had not known what he was looking at before, but he knew it now. He rode home under the stars and felt something he had not felt in years, a kind of warm alertness, like a door he had not known was closed had been opened a crack, and warm air was coming through. July became August, and the Sunday dinners became the anchor of his week. He learned things about Eliza Harper in the way you learn things about a landscape, slowly, by moving through it in different weathers. He learned that she was not quiet by nature but by habit, that she had learned to conserve words the way you conserve water in a dry year, because she had discovered that most people did not listen to women as carefully as they ought to, and she had decided it was more efficient to say only what mattered. He learned that she had a sense of humor that appeared without warning in the middle of serious conversations, dry and quick and then gone again, like a bird through a clearing. He learned that she read everything she could get her hands on, that she had opinions about everything she read, and that she would argue those opinions if challenged, not combatively but with the quiet pleasure of someone who enjoyed having their thinking tested. He brought her books when he could. There was a woman in Caldwell who had a small lending library out of her parlor, and Harvey, who had never been a particular reader, found himself going there with increasing frequency, asking for things he thought Eliza might like. He brought her a collection of natural history essays that she read in 3 days and returned with 17 questions written in the margins in pencil. He brought her a book on land surveying that she found immediately useful. He brought her, on an impulse he could not quite explain, a slim volume of poetry by Walt Whitman, and she held it for a long time before she opened it, running her thumb over the cover, and when she looked up her eyes were very bright. "I haven't read Whitman," she said. "Neither have I," he admitted. "Mrs. Alcott at the parlor library said he was important." "Then we'll both find out," she said, and she kept it. The following Sunday she read him passages aloud while he sat on her porch steps repairing a section of harness she had not gotten to, and the late summer afternoon stretched around them like something generous, and he listened to her voice carrying the words across the golden air and thought, "This is what I want. Not just this moment. All of it." He had not said it. He was not sure how to say it, to a woman who had told him plainly she was not looking to be courted, and who he did not want to spook, because losing these Sundays, this specific quality of Sunday afternoon, would be a loss that he did not know how to name but knew would be serious. But something was shifting. He felt it in himself, and he thought, some Sundays, he felt it in her too. A lengthening of the time she spent looking at him before she looked away, a particular quality of attention when he talked, a warmth in the way she handed him his cup of coffee that was not the warmth of hospitality but something more specific. He was thinking about how to say it when the trouble arrived. The trouble arrived in the form of a man named Claude Aldrich, which was the same Aldrich who had been letting his stock drift onto her land, and who had apparently decided that fencing was an insult requiring response. Harvey found out about it on a Wednesday, when he rode south on a day he had not planned to, because Macready had given him the afternoon unexpectedly, and he had saddled Biscuit without quite making a decision about where he was going. He found Amos standing at the gate with a look on his face that Harvey recognized as the controlled alarm of an old man who did not want to show too much. "She's inside," Amos said. "Been a morning." Aldrich had come at dawn with 2 of his riders and cut a section of her fence and told her, with the particular arrogance of a man who had been large and important in small places for too long, that her claim was on land he considered his by prior use, and that she was a widow woman who would do better to sell and go back east, and that he was not done making his case. Eliza told Harvey all of this at the kitchen table in the flat, careful voice she used when she was most controlled, which he had come to understand meant she was angrier than she appeared. "Did he threaten you directly?" Harvey asked. "He implied," she said. "Men like that are always implying. I'm going to talk to him." "No," she said. "Eliza, Harvey." She said his name the way she said everything, with full attention behind it, and he stopped. "I know you want to help, I appreciate it, but if you go talk to him it becomes something between 2 men and my claim disappears into the middle of it. This is my land. I need to handle it in a way that keeps it mine." He sat with that. He did not like it. He liked it less because he knew she was right. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I'm going to the county land office tomorrow to file a formal boundary complaint and get the survey on record," she said. "And then I'm going to write to the territorial governor's office, because Aldrich is not the only woman he has done this to. There's a Mrs. Carney 20 miles east who sold her claim last winter under pressure, and I believe if I can document a pattern." She kept talking and Harvey listened, and he thought, there it is again. That thing she is. Not hard, not soft. She did not want to fight Aldrich with guns or with someone else's strength. She wanted to fight him with documents and law and the slow, grinding machinery of justice, because she understood. He was coming to understand this about her, that for a woman in 1878 Kansas, those were the tools that left things in her name when it was done. He drove her to the county land office Thursday morning, because she did not ask him not to, and he sat in the hall while she went in and filed her complaint and spoke to the surveyor about scheduling a formal assessment. And he thought about what it meant that he was willing to sit in a hall for 2 hours for a woman he had known less than 4 months, and it felt like the most natural use of time he had ever made. In October, two things happened. The first was that the county surveyor came and confirmed the boundaries of the Harper claim and recorded them formally, and Aldrich's implied arguments about prior use dissolved because he had not filed anything in years, and the record was clear. He did not disappear. Exactly, men like that rarely fully disappeared, but he retreated into the muttering kind of resentment that had nowhere to go, and Eliza's fence stood. The second thing was that Harvey Cooper told Eliza Harper he was in love with her. He had not planned to say it that particular Sunday. He had planned to keep quiet about it for a while longer, to give her the time she had implicitly asked for, to let things unfold at whatever pace she was comfortable with. But they were washing up after dinner, and she was telling him something about the natural history book she had read, and she turned from the wash basin, and there was a soap bubble on her cheek, and the afternoon light was in her hair, and she looked at him with those warm brown eyes that saw everything clearly, and he said it. "I'm in love with you, Eliza." Silence. Not the painful kind exactly, but a silence with weight. She set down the dish she was drying and she looked at him very carefully, and he could see her thinking, which was one of the things he had come to find most remarkable about her. You could actually see the thinking. She did not hide it. "I asked you not to court me," she said. "I know," he said. "I wasn't trying to, it happened, and I thought you deserved to know. I'm not asking you for anything." "Yes, you are," she said, but she said it gently. "You are Harvey. You're asking me to do something with that." He was quiet. She was right, of course. She turned and looked out the window at the flat October plain. "I've been happy," she said, and the way she said it, past tense, told him something. "This year here on this land I've been happy, more than I expected to be, and on Sundays I've been—" She paused, searching for the word with the care of a woman who did not use words carelessly. "I've been particularly happy." He waited. "I didn't want more than that," she said. "It seemed dangerous to want more." "Why?" he asked. She turned back and looked at him directly, because she did not know how to do anything any other way. "Because the last time I loved someone and built something with him, I buried him," she said. "And I kept going, and I am glad I kept going, but it cost something. And I don't know if I have." She stopped. "Eliza," he said, and his voice was very quiet, "I'm not asking you to risk everything tonight. I'm telling you something true that you ought to know." She looked at him for a long moment, and then, with the same deliberate courage she brought to fence building and water rights meetings, she said, "I think about you every day. I have since July at least, probably before." She said it plainly, as though admitting something to herself as much as to him. "That's the truth of it." He did not move. He did not want to move wrong. He stood very still and said, "What do you want to do about it?" She gave a short laugh, surprised out of her, and it was the best sound he had heard in years. "I don't know," she said. "I genuinely don't know." "All right," he said. "We don't have to know tonight." She nodded. She looked down at the dish towel in her hands. "You'll still come on Sundays, wild horses," he said. She smiled, and it was the small, private smile, the one that was not for show but just came out of her. He rode home that night in the cold October wind, and he felt lighter than he had in longer than he could remember. Not because anything was settled, but because something true had been said out loud, and there was an enormous freedom in that. The weeks that followed were different. The same in the surface details: Sunday dinners, books, long conversations on the porch or at the kitchen table while the prairie wind ran itself against the walls of her small house. But there was a new quality to the time, something that sat between them the way warmth sits between two people close together, not mentioned but very much present. He started touching her. Not presumptuously, not in ways that overstepped, but in the small particular ways that meant something. His hand at her elbow helping her down from the wagon. Hers briefly on his arm when she was making a point and wanted him to pay attention, which was unnecessary because he was always paying attention. Sitting closer on the porch steps than was strictly necessary, until one October evening their shoulders were touching and neither of them moved away. She reached over, one evening in November, with no preamble and no announcement, and took his hand. Just that. Sat beside him on the steps with the cold stars coming out above the flat dark land, and held his hand, and he held hers back, and they sat that way for a long time without saying anything, and he thought that this particular quiet was the finest thing he had experienced. "Harvey," she said eventually, not looking at him. "Yes. I'm not sure I'll ever be the kind of woman who makes things easy," she said. "I don't want easy," he said immediately and with certainty. She turned and looked at him, very close now in the cold, her breath a small cloud between them. "What do you want?" "This," he said. "You, whatever you are and whatever that looks like." She looked at him for a long time. The stars were very bright. He could see them reflected in her eyes. She kissed him. It was brief and deliberate, the way she did everything, fully meant. And then she pulled back and looked at him again, assessing, and whatever she found in his face seemed to satisfy her, because she leaned her head against his shoulder and said nothing, and he put his arm around her and they sat in the November night until it was too cold to stay any longer. He found Macready in the morning and told him he was looking for land. Macready was a good foreman, which meant he was perceptive and did not waste words. He looked at Harvey for a moment and said, "That Harper widow." "Yes," Harvey said. "How much have you got put by?" Harvey told him. It was not a vast sum, but it was several years of careful trail wages, because he had never spent freely and had always had in the back of his mind some dim notion of land of his own. "Reardon's been thinking about selling the south parcel," Macready said. "It borders the Harper claim." Harvey stood very still. "What?" Macready almost smiled. "You should talk to Reardon." He talked to Reardon that same afternoon. Jacob Reardon was a large, deliberate man who had built his operation from nothing and respected people who wanted to do the same. He had a section of land, about 640 acres of good grass with a seasonal creek, that bordered both the Reardon North pasture and the Harper claim on its east edge. He had been considering what to do with it for a year. The price was more than Harvey had, not impossibly more, but more. "I can do 2/3 now," Harvey said. "The rest within 2 years." Reardon looked at him for a long time. He had known Harvey Cooper for 4 years, through 4 trail drives, and he was a man who judged character the way he judged horses, by what they did when things got hard. "You buy that land," Reardon said slowly. "You're not leaving for trail work again." "No, sir," Harvey said. "I'm not," Reardon nodded. "I'll draw up the papers." Harvey rode south that Sunday with the deed in his jacket pocket and found Eliza at the fence on the east edge of her property, checking the tension on the wire, and he stood beside her and showed her the papers. She read them. She read them carefully, as she read everything. Then she looked up at him. "This land borders mine," she said. "Yes. You bought it on purpose." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. The winter wind moved through the dry grass. "What are you saying, Harvey?" He took the deed back and put it in his pocket and looked out at the land. His land, her land. The flat, beautiful, difficult Kansas plain with its enormous sky and its uncompromising demands. "I'm saying that I want to build something here," he said. "I'm saying that I want to be your neighbor for a start, and if you'll have me, something more than that. I'm saying I'm not going anywhere." She stood with her hands on the fence wire and she looked at the land and then she looked at him and her eyes were very bright. "I haven't been asked a second time, Harvey," she said quietly. "Daniel was the first. I haven't been asked since." "I know," he said. "I'm asking." She looked at him for so long that he felt the full weight of the moment. The whole year of Sunday dinners and fence posts and water rights meetings and books and that November night on the steps, all of it stacked up in the space between them. "Yes," she said. Just that word. He reached out and took her hand off the fence wire and held it, and she turned and put her free hand flat against his chest, over his heart, and they stood together on the edge of their land with the winter wind going past them, and he thought, "This is real. This is solid. This is the kind of thing that holds." They married in the spring of 1879, in the small church in Caldwell on a Saturday morning in April when the prairie was beginning to turn green, and the sky was the particular blue it only is in spring, before the summer heat bleaches it out. The church was not full, because neither of them had vast social circles, but it was full of the right people. Amos, who cried without embarrassment and blew his nose on a large handkerchief. Macready, stiff and dignified in a good coat. Eliza Harper from the general store and his wife. Mrs. Alcott from the parlor library, who had brought the Whitman and therefore felt, Harvey thought, something like a patron saint of the whole affair. A handful of the ranch hands who had come to think of Harvey as their own, and a family from Missouri, Eliza's younger sister, Clara, who had made the 2-day journey by train and stage with her husband and small child, and who wept much more openly than Amos had. Eliza wore a dress of blue wool that Clara had brought from a seamstress in St. Joseph, and she wore her dark hair up with small white flowers that grew wild on the edge of the creek, and she walked down the aisle of that small church with the same deliberate, self-possessed walk with which she did everything. And Harvey stood at the front and watched her come, and felt something so full it was almost difficult to hold. She looked him in the eye the whole way up the aisle. She looked him in the eye when she said her vows, and her voice did not waver. He looked her in the eye when he said his, and his did not waver either. "I do," she said, with the full meaning of a woman who had considered what those words cost and had decided they were worth it. Afterward, in the street outside the church, Clara pulled Eliza into an embrace that lasted a long time, and Harvey stood a little apart and watched his wife be held by her sister, and saw in Eliza's face something he had not seen before, a softening that was nothing like weakness, the particular ease of a person who is fully loved by someone who has known them a long time. He filed it away in his heart as one of the most important things he had ever seen. The celebration was at Eliza Harper's house, because the Harmons had the largest parlor in town, and Mrs. Harper had insisted. There was roast chicken and cornbread and dried apple pie, and Eliza had found a fiddle player from somewhere, and the evening got warm and loud in the way of good occasions among people who are genuinely glad. At some point Harvey found himself at the edge of the room watching Eliza across it, talking to Clara with the animation she reserved for people she trusted, using her hands to make a point, and then laughing at whatever Clara said back, throwing her head back with it, and he thought, "I get to see this for the rest of my life." He was watching her so fixedly that Macready appeared beside him with 2 glasses of cider and said, dryly, "She's not going anywhere, Cooper." "No," Harvey said. "You're staring." "I know," Harvey said again, unashamed, and took the cider. They spent their first night as married people in Eliza's house, their house now, and the next morning they were both up before sunrise because the cattle needed feeding and the fence needed checking and the world did not pause for weddings, which was, Harvey thought, just exactly the kind of life Eliza Harper had always wanted and that he had not known he was looking for. The summer of 1879 was hard. There was a drought in July and August that dried the seasonal creek on Harvey's section to a trickle, and the grass went brown faster than it should have, and they had to make difficult decisions about the cattle. They worked alongside each other through it with the particular solidarity of 2 people who have both been alone and know what it is to face hard things without a partner. They did not catastrophize, did not blame, did not despair. They assessed, decided, moved forward. Harvey sold half of his cattle early at a price he did not like, because it was better than waiting. Eliza reorganized the water system, diverting the remaining creek flow to cover the most critical pasture, and she wrote a long and detailed letter to the county commissioners about drought management that she read aloud to Harvey at the kitchen table before she sent it, and that he thought was the most comprehensive piece of agricultural thinking he had seen outside of a book. "You should have been a lawyer," he said. "Women can't be lawyers," she said. "You should be anyway," he said. She looked at him with that expression she had sometimes, the one that had no exact name but that he had come to think of as the look she gave things she treasured, warm and clear and a little guarded, as though she was aware of caring for something and was not entirely comfortable with how much. "Don't make me cry before supper," she said. He laughed. She set the letter aside and went to the stove, and he went to wash up, and when they sat down to eat the drought was still there outside. But the kitchen was warm and full of something he thought might be the most important thing in any life: the specific comfort of being known by someone. In September of 1879, Eliza told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning before coffee, sitting at the kitchen table with a look on her face that was complex enough that for one wild moment he did not know what to make of it. Then he understood what she was saying, and he sat down across from her and took both her hands in his. "Are you all right?" he said first. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," she said. "Mostly. A little frightened." She paused. "I was frightened with Daniel, too, when we thought there might be a child before he died." She looked at their hands together on the table. "There wasn't. And then he was gone, and I told myself it was all right. I was managing. I didn't need something I couldn't have." He waited because she was working towards something and she needed the space to get there. "I want this child," she said very simply. "I want it considerably more than I had expected to want anything again." She looked up at him. "I just wanted to say that plainly before I get on to being practical about it." He squeezed her hands. "Then we start there," he said. "We start with that." She nodded, and something loosened in her face, and she said, "All right, now let me get the coffee on." He smiled and did not let go of her hands for another minute. The baby came in May of 1880, on a warm morning when the prairie was in its best season and the meadowlarks were loud outside the window. It was a boy, healthy and vigorous, with Harvey's dark coloring and Eliza's fierce, assessing gaze, which was evident from the very first day, and that made Harvey laugh with a helpless delight that he was not even slightly embarrassed by. They named him James Daniel Cooper, James for Harvey's father, Daniel for Eliza's first husband, because she had asked about it quietly one evening, and Harvey had said, without hesitation, that he thought it was right, because Daniel had been a good man who had brought her to this land, and he did not think love was a place where you had to choose between the living and the dead. Eliza had cried then properly, in the way she rarely let herself, and Harvey had held her until she was done, and then she had wiped her face and said, "Thank you," with the full weight of everything she meant. Little James Daniel Cooper turned out to be an excellent baby, demanding and full of opinions from the start, which delighted Eliza and did not surprise Harvey in the slightest. Amos, who was 71 years old and had worked the land his whole life and had never married, became something like the child's grandfather by general agreement. He showed up most mornings and sat on the porch and talked to James in the way old men talk to babies, which is to say seriously and at length, and James fixed him with that serious gaze and listened to every word. Harvey watched them one morning from the barn doorway, Amos in his old chair with James balanced on his knees, the morning sun on both of them, the meadowlarks singing, and he felt it again, that fullness that was almost too much to hold, and he thought about the man he had been before this, the man who had ridden in from the Kisham Trail 3 years ago with aching bones and a spirit gone hollow, and he could barely remember what that hollowness had felt like. In the fall of 1880, the Aldrich matter came back. It came back in a different form than before. Aldrich himself had sold his operation in the spring and moved east, to Harvey and Eliza's private relief. But the man who bought it was a land company out of Topeka with more money and more lawyers and a very different approach to expansion. They sent a representative, a well-dressed young man named Fletcher, who arrived at the Harper Cooper property in a buggy and asked to speak with the man of the house. Harvey was in the south pasture when he arrived, and Eliza met Fletcher at the door. And by the time Harvey got back, the conversation was half over. He came through the kitchen to find Eliza at the table with the company's offer letter in front of her and Fletcher sitting across from her with the patient, practiced manner of a man who was used to being eventually successful. Fletcher looked up at Harvey with visible relief and said, "Mr. Cooper, perhaps you can—" "Mrs. Cooper has been handling this," Harvey said, and pulled out a chair and sat beside his wife. "I'm here to listen." Fletcher blinked. He looked between them. Eliza did not look up from the letter. "The offer is for the combined acreage," Eliza said to Harvey. "They want both sections." "What's the number?" she told him. It was a fair price in the cold arithmetic of land sales, and they both knew it. "We're not selling," Eliza said, still not looking at Fletcher. "Mrs. Cooper, the company is—" "We're not selling," she said again, and looked up then with the full force of that direct gaze. "I've been on this land since 1877. My husband has been on his since 1878. We have a son who will inherit it. We're not selling." Fletcher tried a few more approaches, all of which met the same quiet, absolute wall. He was not a bad man, Harvey thought, just a man doing a job in the way of men who did not think carefully about the people behind the land they were buying and selling. Eventually he packed up his papers and left with the air of a man who was surprised that this had not worked the way he expected. When the buggy was gone, Eliza sat for a moment at the kitchen table without moving. Then she looked at Harvey and said, "They'll come back." "Probably," he said. "I want to be ready when they do." "What do you need?" She thought about it with her usual thoroughness. "I want to talk to a lawyer," she said. "I want to understand exactly what our rights are if they try to tie us up in a boundary challenge or anything like that. And I want to get both deeds recorded in the county book under both our names." "Both," he said, because it mattered to say aloud. "Both," she confirmed and met his eyes, and there was everything in that exchange. Years of Sunday dinners and fence wire and water rights meetings, and a marriage that had been built from honesty, the way a good fence is built, post by post and strand by strand. They went to the lawyer in Caldwell the following week. His name was Mr. Prentice, a careful and thorough man who had been practicing law in Kansas since before statehood, and who had seen enough of land company tactics to take Eliza's concerns seriously. He reviewed their deeds and their survey records and the formal boundary complaint from 1878, and said that their position was solid and that any challenge would be expensive and time-consuming for the company and would likely not succeed. "You've kept excellent records," he told Eliza. "I always have," she said. The land company sent Fletcher twice more over the following months, and twice more Eliza sent him away, and eventually the company moved on to easier targets. Harvey watched the whole thing with an admiration that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with respect. She was protecting what was theirs with every tool available to her, and she was doing it successfully. The winter of 1880 into 1881 was a hard one, and a good one. Hard because the cold came early, and the snow came deep, and there were days when getting from the house to the barn was a significant undertaking, and the cattle needed constant attention, and the fuel supply required more careful management than usual. Good because the house was warm and James was a year old and had discovered walking, which filled every room with a hazardous enthusiasm that made Eliza laugh in the involuntary, uncontrolled way she rarely laughed, and because the long evenings gave them time for the books and the conversations that had been the first good thing between them. Harvey read Whitman himself that winter. He read it slowly, the way he suspected Whitman intended, and he told Eliza what he thought about each poem, and she told him what she thought, and they disagreed about several, which led to the most spirited conversations they had since the water rights meeting. "You're arguing that the I in the poem is meant to be the universal self," she said one evening, with the quiet intensity of someone who cared very much about getting this right. "I'm arguing that if it's only personal, then a lot of it makes no sense," he said. "That's not the same argument. It is if you follow it through." "Follow it through then," she said, and she was smiling that private smile. He loved this. He loved that she would say follow it through, not because she had given up but because she wanted him to. He loved that she had not become easier to disagree with over the course of knowing her but had remained exactly as rigorous, and that this rigor was not directed at him but alongside him, the way two people who are genuinely matched argue, not to win but to get closer to the truth. He followed it through. She pushed back. They reached something like agreement around midnight, and sat quietly in the lamplight for a while, comfortable in the way of people who have been through enough together that comfortable silence is one of the gifts they give each other. "I love you," he said into the quiet. She looked at him. She said it back. She always said it back. She was not a woman who withheld things she meant, but tonight she said it differently, with an added quality of reflection, as though she were considering the whole scope of what had led to the moment. "I love you," she said. "I didn't think I would again. I want you to know that I know how remarkable it is." He reached over and took her hand. "I know," he said. "I feel that too." She nodded, and they held hands in the lamplight, with the snow outside and the child asleep in the next room and the books on the table between them. And it was, Harvey thought, as fine as any moment he had ever lived. In the spring of 1882, Eliza became pregnant again, and this time she was calmer about it. Still careful, still honest about her fears, but moving through them with a steadiness that was different from before. She had a year and a half of James to know that she was capable of this kind of love, that she could be a mother and still be herself, that the two things did not cancel each other out. The baby came in November of 1882, earlier than expected and faster than the first, and when the doctor had gone and Amos had been sent to tell Macready, who had taken it upon himself to care about their news, Harvey sat beside his wife on the bed with the new child between them and looked at her face. She was tired in the deep way of a woman who has done extraordinary physical work, and her hair was loose around her face, and she was looking at the baby with an expression of absolute absorption. The child was a girl, smaller than James had been, with a wisp of dark hair and the same intent gaze. "Ruth," Eliza said. He had not known she had chosen a name. "Ruth," he agreed. "After my mother," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders very gently, and she leaned against him without looking away from the baby, and he felt the weight of her against his side and thought, all of it. Every hard mile of trail and every hollow evening and everything that did not fit, until he rode into Caldwell on a spring day and stood on a boardwalk and watched a woman argue with a mule. All of it had been the road to this particular moment, and he would not have changed a step. Ruth Harper Cooper turned out to be the loudest person on the property within 3 months of her arrival, with opinions about everything and a personality that James met with equal intensity and occasional irritation. And the house that had once been too quiet in two different kinds of ways was now almost never quiet at all. Amos, who was by now 74 and slower in his bones but no less sharp in his mind, declared Ruth to be exactly like her mother and Harvey to be responsible for nothing. Eliza overheard this and said, "That is the greatest compliment I have ever received," and Amos laughed until he had to sit down. By 1883, the farm was genuinely thriving. They had consolidated the two sections effectively, sharing labor and equipment. They had a small cattle operation and a good kitchen garden, and a root cellar that Eliza had spent one whole autumn designing, and that Harvey had built to her specifications. An undertaking that had involved 3 arguments about load-bearing angles and 1 argument about drainage, and had resulted in the best root cellar in the county, according to Macready, who came to inspect it with the air of a man who had learned to take Harvey's wife's engineering instincts seriously. Harvey bought good horses. He had an eye for horses that Eliza did not share. She said flatly that she could not tell a good horse from a bad one, and she preferred to know her limitations. But she trusted his judgment on it, and he bought well, and their small horse operation supplemented the cattle income in years when cattle prices dropped. Clara came to visit in the summer of 1883 and stayed for 3 weeks, bringing her husband Will and their 2 children. And the house was fuller than it had ever been, and louder and more cheerful. Clara was warmer and softer in her manner than Eliza, openly emotional in ways that Eliza never quite was, and Harvey watched them together with affection. These 2 sisters who had come from the same Missouri schoolteacher's house and turned out so differently and loved each other so fiercely for it. One evening after the children were in bed, he sat on the porch with Will, who was a quiet, decent man in the hardware trade, and they talked about ordinary things, prices and weather and what was happening in Washington that everyone had an opinion about. And at some point, Will said, with the directness of a man who had been drinking enough cider to be honest, Clara worried about her, you know. Before you, she wrote to us every week and Clara could read between the lines. She was doing well, but she was very alone. Harvey looked at the lit window where he could see Eliza and Clara's shadows moving, talking, passing a lamp between them. I know, he said. She seems different now, Will said. Not softer exactly. More, he searched for it. More rooted, like she always knew who she was, but now she also knows where she belongs. Harvey was quiet for a moment. That's a good way to put it, he said. He thought about the first Sunday dinner, and the fence posts, and the November night with the stars. He thought about the deed in his jacket pocket, and the way she had looked at him across the fence and said yes. He thought about James in the morning light with Amos and Ruth, with her impossible volume, and Eliza at the kitchen table with a book or a letter, or an argument she was building, careful word by careful word. He thought about the fact that every morning he woke up beside her, and every morning it was still real, still solid, still the thing he had known it was from the moment she turned on that wagon seat and looked at him with those warm, direct, assessing eyes. He could not have told anyone exactly how he had known. You could not point to one thing and say, "There, that is where it began." You could say it was the mule, which was as good a starting point as any. You could say it was the water rights meeting, or the first Sunday dinner, or the November porch, or the deed, or the vow. You could say it was every moment that she had turned out to be neither the thing he expected nor the thing he feared, but something he had not had a name for and had spent a year and more discovering. He had seen hard women and soft women in his life, and he had understood both, and Eliza Harper had been neither, and he had not known what to do about that, and the answer, it turned out, had been to stay. To show up every Sunday and stay. To be honest and be patient and be present, and to trust that something he could not categorize was not therefore something to be afraid of, but something to be known. In 1884, Eliza's letter about drought management and county water resources found its way, through a chain of correspondences she had not entirely expected, to the desk of a woman in Topeka who was organizing one of the first agricultural cooperatives for small claims in Kansas. The woman wrote to Eliza, and they wrote back and forth for several months, and in the spring of 1885, Eliza was asked to speak at a regional meeting in Wichita about water rights and small claim management. Told Harvey about it at the kitchen table with the particular tone she had when she was working up to something. "I want to go," she said. "Then you should go," he said. "It's 3 days. The children, I can manage 3 days," he said. "James is 5. He's been helping with the horses since spring. He'll manage 2. She looked at him across the table with that look again, the guarded, warm, treasuring one. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," he said. "Eliza, this is important. You've been thinking about this for years. Go say it out loud to people who can use it." She was quiet for a moment. And then she said, with a care that told him it was something she had been turning over privately for a long time, "Daniel always said that I should be saying things out loud. He used to call it a waste, that I was thinking things and writing them down and no one beyond our kitchen knew about it." Harvey looked at her. "He was right," he said. "He was completely right." She looked down at her hands on the table. "I think he would have liked you," she said. "That's a strange thing to say, but I believe it." "I think I would have liked him," Harvey said. She nodded, and there was a long, good silence, the kind that holds everything they were and everything they had come from and everything they were choosing now. She went to Wichita. She came back with 2 new correspondences, a notebook full of ideas about cooperative water management, and a quality of energized purpose that Harvey had only seen in her in its smaller forms, and that at full strength was one of the most remarkable things he had ever been next to. She talked through dinner and after dinner, and they were up until midnight. And James, who had been allowed to stay up past his bedtime on the grounds that his mother had been away, sat between them at the table and listened with the serious attention of a child who understood that something important was happening. Little Ruth had no patience for policy discussions and had gone to sleep at her normal time, which Eliza said was entirely sensible and a quality she hoped the child retained. By 1887, the cooperative that the Topeka woman had organized included 47 small claims across 3 counties, and Eliza was one of its most active members, writing and speaking and advocating with the patient, relentless thoroughness that Harvey had watched her bring to every fence post and every document and every argument she had ever decided was worth making. She did not become famous. It was not the kind of work that became famous, and she did not want it to, she said once, because the moment it was about the person making the argument rather than the argument itself, you had already lost something. But she was known in the county and in the region among people who worked the land, and her voice, that clear, measured, unhurried voice, carried weight. Harvey told her once that she should write it all down properly, the water management ideas and the cooperative principles and the boundary claim strategies, in a form that people could use without having to correspond with her individually. She said she did not have time. He said he would help. She said that was different. It took 3 years in the evenings after the children were in bed, but they wrote it. Or rather, she wrote it and he questioned it and she revised and he pushed for clarity in the places where she had assumed knowledge the reader might not have. And in 1890, the County Agricultural Extension published it as a practical guide. It was not a book, exactly. It was 32 pages. But the week it appeared, Amos, who was 79 and had not been anywhere much in years, asked Harvey to drive him to the land office to get a copy, and he held it on the ride back and said, "I knew that woman was something particular the first time I met her," with the emphatic certainty of a man whose right to be emphatic has been thoroughly earned. Harvey drove and did not say anything, because what was there to add? James Cooper turned 10 in May of 1890, and Harvey took him out on horseback that morning before sunrise, just the 2 of them, and they rode to the top of the low rise that was the highest point on their land and watched the sun come up over the plain. James was a serious boy with his mother's eyes and his father's patience, and he sat on his horse without fidgeting and watched the light change across the grass, and after a while he said, "Papa, is this ours?" "All the way to that fence line east," Harvey said, "and the creek on the south and north to the road." James was quiet, taking it in. "And when you're old, it'll be mine." "And Ruth's," Harvey said firmly. James nodded. He had not questioned this, just filed it. "What was it like before?" he said. "Before you and Mama?" Harvey thought about how to answer a 10-year-old's version of that question. "Before your mother, it was good land, but it wasn't home," he said. "Just land." "After your mother, it was home." James considered this. "Because of love," he said, with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to be self-conscious about saying true things. "Because of love," Harvey said, "and because she fought for it. You know what your mother is like when she decides something is worth fighting for." James smiled, the small, private smile that was so absolutely his mother's that Harvey's heart did something complicated. "She's relentless," James said. "Relentless," Harvey agreed. "Don't ever forget that. She fought for this land and for this family, and she is the reason it is what it is." James nodded very seriously. "Then, you fought too." "Showed up," Harvey said. "Mostly I just kept showing up." James looked at him with those amber-brown eyes. "Is that enough?" "With the right person," Harvey said, "showing up is everything." Ruth at 7 was already everything Amos had predicted and more. She was loud and curious and opinionated and had a particular gift for animals, specifically for the difficult ones, the ones that did not behave, which her father thought was statistically improbable and her mother found entirely logical. She had successfully gentled 2 horses that Harvey had about given up on, talking to them in the same patient, reasoning tone that had stopped a mule in the middle of a Caldwell street in 1878. Eliza watched her daughter with the horse the first time and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "Where did she learn that?" Harvey said, "I believe she got it from you." Eliza turned and looked at him, and she looked like she was going to say something practical and deflecting, and then she didn't. She just looked at him, and he looked back, and there was between them all the years. Every Sunday dinner and every drought and every land company representative and every evening with the books and every child and every argument about angles and every moment that was so ordinary it was almost invisible. And that was in fact what a life was made of. If you were lucky, if you were patient, if you said yes when someone stood at your fence with a deed in his pocket and looked at you with all his honest intentions visible. Amos died in the autumn of 1891, at 80 years old, in his own bed in his own cabin at the edge of the property, with Harvey beside him and Eliza's hand in his. He died as he had lived, quietly and without complaint, and with a practicality about the whole thing that was its own kind of grace. He had told Harvey, the week before, that the land looked good, that the grass was coming in well, that the Harper Cooper operation was one of the finest small operations in the county, and he had been proud to see it built. They buried him on the property, at the edge of the east pasture where he liked to sit in the mornings, and Eliza stood at the grave with her children on either side of her, and said something simple and true about a man who had been on this land before any of them, and who had welcomed her without condition when she came, and who had never once treated her as anything other than the person who knew best what this land needed. Harvey stood beside her and felt the full weight of the kind of grief that is not devastating but is real, the specific sorrow of losing someone whose presence has been so constant that you have taken it for granted, which is perhaps the greatest proof of how much they mattered. The winter of 1891 was quiet, the way winters are after a loss, with a particular quality of stillness that is not merely the absence of sound but a conscious sitting with what is gone. They talked about Amos in the evenings, the way you talk about people you have loved when they are safely past the sharp edge of the grief, with memory and sometimes laughter, the way Amos had of stating obvious things as though they were revelations, the way he had talked to James as an infant with the serious delivery of a senator, the way he had held Ruth's hand on their first walk to the east pasture and narrated every fence post. "He was the first person who made me feel like this was my land," Eliza said one evening. "When I first came, everyone else in the county was careful about me, politely uncertain. Amos just handed me a fence tool and said, 'Here's what needs doing.'" "That sounds like him," Harvey said. "I would have been much lonelier without him those first months," she said. She looked at Harvey. "And then you came along. And then I laughed at a mule," he said. She smiled. "You laughed at me." "I laughed at the situation," he said. "I was very impressed with you. You were perplexed by me," she said, with the gentle accuracy she had always applied to him. "Both," he said. "I was both." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "I know," she said. "I was perplexed by you too. You kept being different from what I expected." "Different how?" She thought about it. "You didn't try to help me in ways I didn't need. When I said I didn't want something, you heard it. That was," she paused. "That was rarer than it ought to be." He turned his hand over under hers and held it. "I was raised to listen," he said. "My mother was a woman with opinions. My father used to say that the best thing he ever did was learn to hear the difference between what she was saying and what he expected her to say." Eliza looked at him. "I would have liked your mother," she said. "She'd have thought you were the finest thing I ever did," he said, and he meant it entirely. She looked at their hands together on the table. "Harvey," she said. "Yes." "I want you to know," she said, with the full deliberate care of a woman who saves her most important statements for the moments that deserve them, "that this, all of it, this life we have, this is not what I expected. When I came west with Daniel, I hoped for something. I hoped we could build something honest and lasting and real. And then he was gone, and I kept going because that is what you do, and I thought perhaps what I had hoped for was something that had been and was done." She stopped. Her thumb moved across his knuckle. "And then you sat down at my kitchen table and ate beans and cornbread and asked about the land like you actually wanted to know, and you kept coming back, and I want you to know that I know how extraordinary that is. You are extraordinary to me." He felt it in his chest, the whole weight of it. "You're extraordinary to me," he said. "You always have been, from the first morning." She looked up at him, and the lamplight was on her face, and she was 40-something now, and there were lines around her eyes, and her dark hair was streaked with gray, and she was, to Harvey Cooper, the most beautiful thing in the world, in the way that things you love deeply become beautiful, absolutely and permanently and without qualification. "Come here," he said. She came around the table, and he stood up to meet her, and she put her arms around him, and he held her. And they stood in their kitchen in the lamplight, with the prairie winter outside and the children asleep in the next room, and more than a decade of this life between them and ahead of them still. And he thought, This is what I would choose if I could choose anything. This particular woman and this particular life, and all the ways she surprised me, and all the ways I surprised myself, and all the fence posts, and all the Sundays, and everything I did not know what to do about, and then learned. In the spring of 1892, James turned 12 and asked to begin working the horses with his father in earnest, and Harvey said yes, and started teaching him what he knew. And Ruth turned 9, and decided she wanted to learn to read Spanish because she had met a family at the cooperative meeting who spoke it, and she thought it was important. And Eliza began teaching her from a primer she ordered from a bookshop in Topeka that took 6 weeks to arrive and was worth every day of waiting. The town of Caldwell had changed in the years they had been there. The great cattle drives were winding down as the railheads pushed further north and the ranges filled in, and the wild quality of the early cattle town years was giving way to something quieter and more settled. Businesses that had catered to drovers closed or changed. Families put down roots. Schools improved. The territorial wildness that had defined the region through the 70s was becoming something else, something more ordinary in its ambitions if not in its landscape. Harvey thought about this sometimes, about what it meant to have come in the middle of a particular era and to watch it change around you. He had come on the Kishom Trail, and he would not drive the trail again. That time was passing. The land company men would still come, and the droughts would still come, and the winters would still come, but the shape of the world was different from what it had been, and he found he did not mourn it. What he had was not dependent on any era. What he had was on a specific piece of Kansas ground, with a woman who had named it home before he arrived, and had made it home in the fullest sense by the time he caught up to her. He told her this one morning in the kitchen, stumbling through it with less eloquence than he wanted, and she listened and then said, "You're saying that what matters is what we built, not the time it was built in." "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. "That's good, because I intend to keep building." He smiled at his coffee cup. "I know," he said. "I'm counting on it." And she had. She would continue to do so. The guide she had written was read by more people every year, and the cooperative extended its reach, and the letters came and went, and the kitchen table was always covered in something. Plans, papers, books, a child's homework, a letter from Clara in Missouri, a drawing Ruth had made of the East pasture. James's growing handwriting on a piece of paper where he was working out under his mother's guidance, the mathematics of water flow and land gradient, because Eliza had decided that if the land was to be his and his sister's, they both ought to understand it fully. Harvey watched it all. He worked beside it and in it and with it every day. He did not always know what to say about it, which had been true from the beginning, from that first morning on the boardwalk when he had stood with his hat in his hand and not known what category to put her in. He had stopped trying to find the category. She was simply Eliza. She was simply his, and he was simply hers, and all of it was simple in the end if you stayed honest about it. On a Sunday in the spring of 1893, 15 years after he had first ridden into Caldwell with an aching back and a hollow spirit, Harvey Cooper saddled Biscuit's successor, a young sorrel named Penny that James had helped him select, and rode the perimeter of their land as he did every Sunday morning before the household was fully awake. He rode the east line and the south line and along the creek and up to the rise where the grass was the deepest green after the rains, and he stopped there and looked out over everything. The house with its smoke rising, the barn, the good fences, the east pasture, the horses in the south field, the whole careful structure of a life built from nothing but work and honesty, and two people who had decided to trust each other. He heard a horse behind him and turned, and Eliza came up the rise on her chestnut mare. The original was long gone. This was her third, also chestnut, also compact and quiet, and pulled up beside him. She had gotten up early too, which was not unusual. She was almost always awake before the children, always up before the house needed managing, preferring the quiet hours. They sat side by side on their horses at the top of the rise and looked at what they had built. "The south fence needs checking," she said. "I know," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Eliza Harper would never have believed this," she said. 14 years ago, she would not have believed it." He looked at her. The morning sun was on her face, and her dark and silver hair was in a loose braid, and she was looking at the land with an expression of absolute clear-eyed love, the kind that does not require any softening or any performance, just the plain looking at the thing you love. "She knew how to fight for it," he said. "She knew how to build it, she just hadn't started yet." She turned and looked at him, and her eyes were very bright. "Neither had you," she said. "Neither had I," he agreed. She reached over the space between their horses and took his hand, and they sat that way on the rise with the Kansas morning opening around them in all directions, and the meadowlarks were going in the grass below, and somewhere in the house a child was beginning to stir, and everything was real and solid and built to last. He held her hand and looked out at their land, and he thought about the man who had stood on a boardwalk in 1878 and been stopped in his tracks by a woman who was neither the thing he knew nor the thing he expected, who had fit none of his categories and exceeded all of them, who had said yes when he asked, and had meant it in all the ways a person can mean the most important word, and he thought, "I did not know what to do about her. And then I learned." And then what a thing to be the man who learned. The meadowlarks sang on. The grass moved in the light wind. The smoke rose from their chimney in a steady, unhurried column, and James's voice called from somewhere inside the house, and Ruth answered it with her characteristic volume, and Eliza looked at Harvey with everything she was, and everything he was to her, and he looked back, and the morning held them both, and the land held the morning, and everything was exactly and finally and completely home.